Good morning. My name is Reginald DesRoches, and I am the Provost of Rice University. I am pleased to come together to commemorate this very important event in the history of the United States at what I believe is one of the most critical and pivotal times in our history. If we are going to mark and celebrate Juneteenth, then we should do so with the knowledge and awareness of the history of slavery and the racial legacy that followed. Today's lecture series is an opportunity for us to reflect, to learn, and to begin a conversation on how we might build a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community at Rice and beyond. We have assembled an outstanding group of faculty and guests to speak on a range of topics related to race, racism, and injustice. I would like to thank all of them in advance for their willingness to share with you today, and thank all of you on this webinar for taking the time out of your schedule to be with us. We arranged these talks with a good understanding of the fatigue that comes with sitting in front of a computer for hours on end. We have lectures from 10 to 4, but we have a 1-hour break at 11 and again at 2 p.m. Those are both central times. I hope you'll be able to stay with us throughout the day. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. With that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Alex Byrd. Dr. Byrd is an associate professor in the Department of History at Rice University. He earned a BA from Rice University in 1990 and was a member of Sid Richardson College, and received his PhD from Duke University. Dr. Byrd began his career as a student of free and forced transatlantic Black migration in the era of American Revolution, and his book, Captives and Voyagers, was awarded the 2009 Wesley Logan Prize. He is also a recipient of the 2010 Douglas A. Dare Award for the best article published in the William and Mary Quarterly in the preceding 6 years. Dr. Byrd is a 4-time recipient of the George R. Brown Award for Superior Teaching in 2006, 2013, 2015, and again in 2018. In 2010, he was a recipient of the prestigious Presidential Mentoring Award. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Byrd.
Thank you. The woman with the child on her hip is Jeanette, my wife. That child is now my almost 20-year-old son. And the woman to my wife's left, that's Mrs. Davis. I hope I haven't mangled her name. My 9th grade English teacher at Jack Yates Senior High School, where from the fall of 1982 through the spring of 1986, men and women like Mrs. Davis got down to the business of getting kids like me as ready for the world as you could get kids like me ready for the world in 4 blazingly short years. By kids like me, I mean more things than I can say here. But among all of those things, I also mean Black kids. If you taught at Yates in the 1980s, you probably should have especially been interested in the potential and the diversity and the problems of Black young people, because the school during those years, this was long after the desegregation of the Houston Independent School District, was about 98% Black. Of course, that's not much less Black than the school was in the deepest recesses of the age of Jim Crow. I start here because I want to pose a question that would never have occurred to me from the fall of Prince's Little Red Corvette through the spring of the Jack Yates Lions' perfect 16-0 football season. Is it possible? This is the question. Is it possible in this day and age and in this dynamic, racially diverse city for a historically Black public high school to be too Black? This is a question I think worth asking and grappling with on Juneteenth, because Juneteenth, everything else that it is also about facing questions about the actual meaning and substance of Black freedom, about its limits, about its ideas versus its practicalities, about its ironies and its contradictions. But of course, the question is also a provocation. You should feel provoked. I feel a little provoked. To ask the question is to invite good people to wonder about the motives of folks who would ask it. What does he have against Black schools? That question too, especially on Juneteenth, which is and should be a celebration of Black accomplishment, determination, and achievement, is also a proper response. So what I want to do over the next 12 minutes or so is to move between those two responses. Sharing from some of my work in progress, I want to make a small project out of asking whether it is worthwhile in 2020 to ponder closely some of the whys, the wherefores, and the consequences of how Black some of our historically Black schools still remain. And I want to end up with an answer to the question of whether my question actually deserves to be asked. I want to be quick, so I will proceed somewhat episodically, rushing through a series of facts and brief interpretations toward the end just promised. And the first thing I want to say is that I will not focus here on how Black the student bodies of the city's historically Black high schools remain. And I won't linger over this because in one sense, it is easily explained. The student populations of the city's historically Black high schools remain extraordinarily Black because by and large, we still assign students to schools the same way we assigned them in 1954, via attendance zones that are highly attentive to race, class, and political power. But there are puzzles too regarding the ways the city's Black high schools have evolved since Brown. On average, for instance, 75% of the faculty and staff at the district's historically Black high schools remain African American. That these numbers obtain in a school district where Black teachers comprise just a bit over 35% of the total high school staff is, I think, the more interesting approach to the work I want to do this morning. Why is the teaching workforce of the city's Black high schools so Black? Part of the answer to that question, like the answer to every good question, is historical. There were a significant number of white instructors in Black classrooms in the decades following the Civil War, but a concerted effort on the part of African American preachers, parents, and community leaders resulted in the transformation of the Black school workforce. Consequently, by the second decade of the 20th century, a white teacher leading Black students in the South was a true rarity. The reason Black parents, preachers, educators, and politicians in this age of Jim Crow gave for wanting Black teachers for their children centered on empathy and power. It is impossible, so Bishop James Walker Hood put it in 1869, for white teachers, educated as they necessarily are in this country, to enter into the feelings of colored pupils as the colored teacher does. And this empathy was also about place. It mattered if your English instructor was also your Sunday school teacher. And it definitely mattered if your high school principal regularly crossing paths with your grandmother was an occurrence that you could not reasonably discount. But what about here and now? What kind of residential purchase do employees at today's extraordinarily Black schools have on the communities surrounding their workplaces? As it turns out, the question posed just now doesn't have really clear answers, but recent residential snapshots of the Yates faculty and staff, one taken in 2012 and another in 2019, are illuminating starts, if not definitive. In 2012, more than 70% of the faculty at Yates did not live within the zone, within the Yates attendance zone, or very close to the zone. And on average, faculty and staff resided about a dozen miles from campus, even as 90% of the students at Yates lived much closer, lived within the zone. A dozen miles, what can be made of that? Now, there is no comprehensive information on where teachers at Houston's Black high schools lived during the height of Jim Crow. We'd need that because that comparison would be really useful. But there is evidence, there is some evidence, and the evidence that does exist suggests a significant contrast with the present era. In the early 20th century, for instance, at the city's flagship Black secondary school, the 14 teachers at Booker T. Washington High School resided on average 1.3 miles from campus. In 1915, no teacher at Booker T. Washington High School lived even 3 miles from campus. In fact, more faculty lived not even 1 mile from campus than lived any other iteration of a mile. Other telling ambits are also worth considering. Let's linger for a moment on Robin Street. The school's Latin, algebra, and sixth grade instructors, for instance, all lived in the 200 block of Robin. The math and sixth grade teachers at the very same address. Booker T. Washington's seventh grade and English faculty both resided in the 300 block of Robin. In addition, 8 more Black teachers from other Houston high schools nestled into Robin as well. My goodness, on Robin Street, what indeed was the difference between in school and out of school? It helps too to look at two comparisons, two contemporary comparisons. And I want to look at 2 high schools here. This is a terrible infographic. This doesn't even qualify as an infographic. You deserve better than this, and one day I'll have better. But it makes sense to take a look at 2 high schools, 2 contemporary high schools. One that I'll call a white high school, which is Bel Air High School, and we can talk more about why I would call it that. And another high school, Austin High School, that is more typical of the Houston Independent School District as it stands right now. And I want to call attention to 2 things with Bel Air, especially in 2012. If you'll see in 2012, Bel Air actually had the look more of Booker T. Washington from 1915, with 40% of its faculty living basically in the zone. And if you were student zoned to Bel Air High School in 2012, you'd be fairly likely to run into your teachers in the vicinity of your high school. Bel Air High School in 2012, the faculty there was about 70% white. The faculty there is now 50% white. But again, I'm losing time. So I want to look at Austin High School, which is predominantly Latinx high school in Houston. Population about 94% Hispanic. And you'll see that the faculty is more fully spread across the city. That's also because the racial dynamic of the faculty is much more diverse. The faculty at Austin, in terms of number of white teachers, Black teachers, Asian teachers, and Hispanic teachers, looks like the city as a whole. Whereas the faculty at Bel Air High School and Yates High School are predominantly Black in one instance and overwhelmingly white in the other instance. So with this data, I think we can come to, I'm a historian, I shouldn't have called it data, but with this information, we can come to a few related and preliminary hypotheses. Presently, HISD's identifiably white high schools, identifiably in terms of student population, are staffed in ways that reproduce the relative whiteness and Blackness of their student bodies. And the racial composition of high school faculties likely impacts the residential rootedness of faculty around the school. It's also fairly certain that in the early 20th century, Black teachers resided much more closely to their workplaces than they do now. And even so, presently, the residential rootedness of high school faculties, whatever their various determinants, is not static. It changes over time. There is in some places some significant differences in movement from 2012 and 2019. Lastly, in terms of where faculty live in relation to where they work, the Yates faculty of 2012 looks like the direction that the Bel Air faculty and the Austin faculty went in 2019 in terms of spreading further and further from the workplace, even though the racial characteristics of Yates and Bel Air did not begin to look more like the city. So here's some quick points and questions. One, it's clear from 1915 to the present, right, that one change is that the relationship between race, residence, and the school became more strained. It is no longer clear that Black school segregation also entails powerful forces of residential congregation and community. And without this form of protection, in a post-Jim Crow era, in a city as racially and ethnically diverse as Houston, schools and faculties that reflect, one question that comes to mind is whether schools and faculties that reflect greater swaths of the city are greatly advantaged in some palpable way, advantaged by the ways in which the ethnic and racial networks of the school staff redound to the school itself. It also begs the question of whether there is a converse property. How are Yates and Austin high schools, for instance, affected by the relative racial uniformity and the relative racial diversity of their respective faculties? Is Yates High School isolated from the city and the city's resources in ways that Austin is not? These are just questions, hopefully questions that justify my initial questions. Are more people and more kinds of people in Houston connected to schools like Austin than schools like Yates by virtue of the networks of their faculties? And do those connections affect the kinds of educational outcomes that matter most? The recent history of Yates High School certainly suggests that the school and its needs are met with a peculiar and damning kind of indifference at the district level. The hiring of a school principal, for instance, is the single most important decision that a district's upper administration can make concerning a school. And nevertheless, over the past dozen years, since the 2008 school year, Houston ISD has hired 7 different principals to lead Yates. From 2008 to 2020, the Carnegie Vanguard School has had exactly 1 principal. Bel Air High School and the High School for Performing and Visual Arts and Lamar have had 2. DeBakey High School has been captained by only 3 different administrators since 2008. So now we return to the question. We got a minute to go. Is it possible for a high school to be too Black? My purpose here has not been to lay out a firm answer to this question. My aim, rather, has been to contextualize the question in Houston in a way that makes it possible to address it in a particularly grounded sort of way, a way that I hope makes room for hearing the question and considering it beyond the remarkable provocation that the question itself contains. The question is provocative. I should be absolutely clear now that I'm at the end, because it is a question that is fundamentally racist. At its core, the question suggests that there is some quotient of Blackness beyond which lies great peril. The question is largely racist because it suggests that anti-Blackness is a product of Blackness. The question is racist. But that's not all the question is. The question is not completely and irrecoverably, I would argue, racist. The question is racist, but it also offers a necessary approach to and critical interrogation of approach toward contemporary anti-Black racism. The best way to address problems peculiar to or especially pronounced in Black schools is to root out old white supremacist notions that yet weigh so heavily on American education. Residential attendance zones might be one of those. And to call out and to deconstruct new white supremacist phenomena so that those that have been instituted in the place and beside the old can be moved out of the way. This is the best response. But given the peculiarities of race and place in Houston and the ways in which the education of young people place such large demands on the present, other responses may also be imperative. We should also seek answers to the question that are simply good. In a fair society, it would indeed be possible for a Black high school to have access to all of the resources and the power necessary for its best success. But we do not live in such a society. And this is a long way to go to arrive at a rather old-fashioned answer. But in our public schools, perhaps more fully integrated faculties at our Black high schools and our white high schools and our Latinx high schools are one way forward.
Thank you, Alex. And we have several questions, but I think we only have time for one question, and I'll go in order in which it came. How do you react? The question is, how do you react to Jackie Joyner-Ervin of culturally relevant pedagogy fame, who believes that all Black schools historically, specifically, were better for Black kids than schools today? Can you briefly respond to that question?
Yeah, I would just respond in the same way that W.E.B. Du Bois responded in 1935. And what he said is there were Black schools in 1935 that would do, segregated Black schools in 1935 that were doing tremendous jobs with Black students. And there were mixed schools in 1935 that were pure and utter catastrophes. And so, no, so I'd say that. And I'd also say that overall, right? Overall, I think Black education is much improved from the age of Jim Crow.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Alex, there are a few more questions. I think you have access to the Q&A that you might be able to respond to directly by online. So that would be helpful to the questions. I appreciate it. And thank you.
I will. Thanks a lot.
All right, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Dr. Jenifer Bratter is a professor of sociology at Rice University and director of Building Research in Inequality and Diversity to Grow Equity, otherwise known as BRIDGE. She received her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin in 2001. Her research explores the implications of race and racial mixing in the areas of family, identity, and social inequality. Current projects focus on indicators of social well-being such as poverty, residential segregation, and health, and the new ways that race is linked to these phenomena. She has been awarded the 2009 Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation for Career Enhancement to study patterns of residential segregation for mixed-race families. Dr. Bratter has recently published works appearing in Demography, Social Forces, Family Relations, Population Research, and Policy Review, and has several upcoming book chapters. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bratter.
Okay. All right, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's on this call. It's truly an honor to be here to speak with you today. Again, my name is Jenifer Bratter. I am a sociologist of race and ethnicity here at Rice University. And I just want to thank Provost DesRoches and President Lebron for convening this really powerful and exemplary lecture series. So the title of my talk is Reflecting on the Lessons of Juneteenth, Racial Justice and the Power of Place. So part of the sort of broad context for, I think, even this lecture series, and certainly in sort of how we're thinking about Juneteenth, are the past 3 weeks where we have witnessed a sort of tidal wave of reckoning with systemic racism, and particularly as sort of sparked by the death of George Floyd. And the way this sort of unfolded was encountered, I think, by all of us in a very deeply personal way that literally hit us where we live. When we think about kind of the way in which we sort of experienced this powerful reckoning, it occurred largely through our either involvement or visual appraisal of protests. Protests that emerged within Seattle, within Philadelphia, within Washington, D.C., where Black Lives Matter Plaza was erected, and within Houston, certainly. And part of what is occurring here, both nationally and certainly internationally, is on one hand, and again, a national reckoning with systemic racism, but also a very local one that indicates how we are sort of engaging with our own sort of understanding of sort of local racial issues and racial politics. But this reckoning with the local, and particularly the local of racial justice, was already sort of being experienced in a sort of very recent issues that have to do with the current pandemic. And what I'm talking about is the racial disparities that were unfolding in the early days of the pandemic. When articles initially started being printed about how the pandemic was unfolding, what was clear was that there was a very powerful racial pattern that was occurring, again, within places. St. Louis health director shows that all 12 COVID-19 deaths in St. Louis have been Black. Black and Hispanic populations make up the majority of New York City's coronavirus deaths, state data confirms. And 70% of coronavirus deaths in Louisiana involve Black Americans, despite being 33% of the population. And so what this highlights is how racial injustice or racial inequality is experienced in a very, very localized way. And I think that's really pertinent for us sort of thinking about Juneteenth and its relevance in terms of a current sort of contemporary reckoning with this as a holiday. Juneteenth, as we know, is commemorating June 19th, 1865, which is the celebration of the day the news of emancipation of slaves arrived to Texas. Specifically, Galveston, Texas is when where Major General George Granger announced that the order had been passed. But notoriously, this date was 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And a lot of that is very, very relevant because this has to do with the fact that the news arrived late, in part because it was arriving within a state deep within the Confederacy. And so understanding Juneteenth and what it means is very much about not just when it happened, but where. And so this is sort of the broad theme of my talk today. What does place in its history tell us about the possibilities and limits of racial justice? And so where I want to focus my some of my comments today is in the work that in the research that I do, which focuses on the lives of interracially married couples and families and their children. And I focus on interracial marriages and families as a sort of specific kind of case of how race can matter. Marrying across racial lines has been considered the litmus test of intergroup relationships. And it's been framed that way because, generally speaking, race is the most powerful stratifier, or the most fundamental to sort of mate selection. Adults are more likely to match on race than they are on education, ethnicity, or even religion. And so understanding the cases in which people cross racial lines really tells us about its power as a social boundary. But the fact that this is the way that mate selection happens should not be surprising, given the fact that we are, generally speaking, very segregated. There's clear racial segregation in our neighborhoods, clear racial segregation in our schools. We're actually in an era of resegregation, as the previous talk really outlined. There's clear segregation in churches, clear segregation in our occupations. So the major question for this work is, what are the circumstances that facilitate or limit contact across racial groups within a segregated world? And so what this sort of tells us is that there are conditions on the ground that can kind of shape how or under what conditions people meet, marry, form families across racial groups. And when we take all those conditions into account, the one that emerges as most powerful is place. And if we think about what place means, essentially what we're talking about are conditions under which the national average, conditions under which interrelational marriage happens to be higher or lower. Now, the national average for the United States is about 17% of recently married couples. 17% of recently married couples are interracially married. But this masks a huge variation that occurs across places. The spaces such as Honolulu, Hawaii, that have rates of intermarriage that go up to as high as 42%, Las Vegas, Nevada, that have rates of intermarriage that are about 31%, and Santa Monica, California, that have rates of intermarriage at about 30%. And this is a huge contrast to spaces like Jacksonville, Mississippi, or Asheville, North Carolina, where the rates of intermarriage are about 3%, or even Youngstown, Warren, Ohio, Pennsylvania, where the rates of intermarriage are 4%. And we can ask, as a sort of general question, what makes the first section, the top 3 cities, distinctive from the bottom 3 cities? And some of the explanations that generally come to mind as sort of a broad question is saying, okay, well, these are really diverse places, really cosmopolitan places. These are very liberal spaces. In terms of the characteristics of these cities, we generally find that they are certainly more diverse, but they generally have really small non-white populations, kind of facilitating outmarriage to white populations, as well as they tend to have somewhat lower levels of economic inequality across race. But in thinking about kind of, again, the way in which place matters, we can also think historically in terms of how these places are situated relative to other states within the United States. And with that, we can sort of look back in terms of understanding, again, the role of history where, with regards to interracial marriage, is very much very much highlights the power of place. So interracial marriage has been legal across the country since 1967. This is a picture of Richard and Mildred Loving, who were the plaintiff, and their children, who were the plaintiffs in the Supreme Court case Loving v. Virginia, which was decided in 1967. And that decision essentially said that, stated that that bans against interracial marriage, which were codified in state-specific constitutions, were no longer constitutional, sort of lifting these bans. And at the time, roughly 16 or 17 states had such bans on their states, on their books. And so again, this sort of is usually the watershed moment in which race ceases to matter to, at least legally, who you can marry. But if we take a deeper look in terms of history, we find that this sort of reckoning had happened quite a bit earlier in other states across the country. Specifically, if we look at the case of California, the case of Perez v. Sharp, which again, in the case of Perez v. Sharp, had decided about 20 years earlier, in 1948, that these bans, again, would be, again, off their state books. This was a case where Andre Perez, whose marriage to Sylvester Davis, who was an African-American man, violated state laws banning, her marriage violated state laws banning interracial marriage. And this is Andrea Perez. And so this sort of question of whether or not race can matter to marriage had already been decided within the context of California. And we can ask, what does it mean to have a state opt out of this type of logic around whether or not race should be legally tied to who one could marry? And so this is a map of states that had actually gone through this decision codified by when the interracial marriage bans were repealed. The deep Black states are those where the bans were forcibly repealed by the Supreme Court. The gray ones are laws repealed prior to 1967, again, states that opted out of this ban. And the remaining states are those that never had a ban, states which are about 8 states. And so in research that I conducted with Heather O'Connell, a professor at Louisiana State University, we interrogated whether this differentiation had any bearing on the lives of multiracial families today. And particularly with regards to a sort of another shift in the way we think about race as it matters to daily life in terms of the realm of identity. Now, one of the things that's changed over the past 50 years or 60 years since 1967 is that the US Census now allows individuals to declare multiple races if they want to on their census form. And this is essentially became a way in which interracially married couples or interracial parents could designate an identity publicly for their children that reflected their dual or multiple racial ancestry. Again, sort of highlighting a shift in the way we think about race and how much and how we might want to declare a racial identification. Now, this has been generally embraced broadly by interracial parents. When we look at the data, well over half of offspring of interracial couples are classifying their children as multiracial, or two or more races. But we can also ask, to what degree does this embrace of multiple race categories signal that does history matter when we select racial labels today? And what we found when looking at the rates at which, or the likelihood at which families were designating their children as multiracial, and whether or not this sort of collection of states, or the way in which we are sort of classifying them in terms of repeals, whether or not that mattered, we found that indeed it did, that the probability of labeling a child as multiracial is lowest in states where interracial marriage bans were listed by the Supreme Court, signaling a way in which that history that had happened again, before these couples had probably even certainly met and married and had children, that history had actually shaped the way in which they saw their children, the way in which they identified their children. And we can certainly ask questions about how in which this unfolds, but I think it's important for us to recognize that this history has this lingering effect today. Now, we can also think about how this has impact on other facets of racial justice and other facets of how race matters to everyday life. And in particular, I want to draw attention to the way it matters to health. A recent ProPublica article titled "The Black American Amputation Epidemic" highlights the experience of a doctor, Dr. Farokadi, where he is entering the Deep South in an effort to correct what he sees as, again, this amputation epidemic, where nationally Black patients with diabetes experience amputations at a rate triple of those of white patients. And as the article details, this is, again, a function of a range of disadvantages that have classically been tied to health, including a lack of investigation around whether or not a leg or another limb can be saved. And so in sort of tracking the scope of the problem, what this what Dr. Farokadi identified in terms of mapping mapping the rates at which amputations had occurred is that they had a very kind of regional pattern that clearly, like where these amputations were most common were clearly occurring in certain places, as we can see in the map on the other side. And what he also found, though, is when you compare it to other maps, we see sort of really what is sort of a startling comparison. And so he then sort of found a map that had the same kind of information, at least for the concentration of the enslaved population in 1840, ranging from 0% to 50% within specific counties. And so what we see here is that places that happen to have higher rates of amputation, again, this higher rate of amputation for Black patients, are also states where the enslaved population was concentrated. And in this comparison, what is, I think, being revealed here is that the racial oppression within the era of slavery is still being visited on the health of African Americans today. And we can ask ourselves, again, what are the mechanisms that create this tie? But the first thing we have to reckon with is the fact that this tie exists, that a lot of what we're thinking and experiencing in terms of what creates racial disparities, what creates tremendous disadvantages in health, can be linked back to the conditions of white supremacy, racial hierarchy, racial inequality of a far earlier era, an era that we often think of as being in the past and beyond us. And so where I'd like to end this is more with a question as opposed to answers. So we're returning back to the question of what does place in its history tell us about the possibilities and limits of racial justice? I think the first thing we need to reckon with is that local histories of enslavement and hierarchy do not remain in the past. They are constantly being revisited upon us in a daily way that we have yet to really, truly, I think, appreciate or understand. And so in order to really sort of think about racial justice as a possible reality, it does not only require a sort of reckoning with this history, but a local reckoning with what this history means. So that's where I leave it. And again, thank you so much for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Jenifer. You have a couple of questions. One is really quick, and then the other one perhaps not as quick. The first one is, what is the rate of interracial marriage in Houston? I'm not sure if you have this data.
I do have this data. Thank you so much for asking. The rate as of about 2015 is about 17%, so runs pretty constant with the US numbers.
And the second to last question is, has online dating made any kind of noticeable impact on the rate of interracial marriages?
In terms of noticeable impact, which I guess could be measured in terms of making interracial marriages more likely, I would say yes, in that interracial couples, married couples, are distinctive from same-race couples in that they're far more likely to have interracially dated. So one of the things that makes interracial marriage sort of unique in terms of its kind of occurrence is that it's generally located amongst folks who've had deep engagement with racial difference across the life course. And so individuals, and so there's actually papers that sort of show a statistical association between having had particularly a first partner that's racially different and engaging a first marriage that is with a racially different partner. So it's possible that higher rates of interracial dating will translate into higher rates of marriage, absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Jenifer, appreciate it. You have a few other questions, though. You'll have access to the Q&A. Perhaps you can answer them offline here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And our third and last speaker for this session is Professor Nicole Waligora-Davis. Dr. Waligora-Davis is an associate professor of English at Rice University. She specializes in late 19th and 20th century African-American and American literature and cultural criticism, with a particular emphasis on Black intellectual history, Black internationalism, legal studies, critical race theory, and visual culture. She is the author of Sanctuary, African Americans and Empire, published in 2011. An associate editor of the award-winning Remembering Jim Crow in 2001, Waligora-Davis's essays have appeared in numerous publications, including the Cambridge History of African American Literature, the Cambridge Companion to American Literature After 1945, Centennial Review, African American Review, Modern Fiction Studies, and the Mississippi Quarterly. She is currently working on a book-length study titled The Murder Book, Race, Forensics, and the Value of Black Life. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Waligora-Davis.
Good morning. I want to thank Provost DesRoches and President Lebron for inviting me to share a bit about my work with all of you today in commemoration of Juneteenth. In 1927, W.E.B. Du Bois offered crisis readers a curious update on the closed case of Maurice Mays. A Black businessman and electioneer from Knoxville, Tennessee, Mays was accused of killing Birdie Lindsay, a married white woman, under the cover of night in the early hours of August 30th, 1919. His case unfolded over a 3-year period that included a race riot, trial conviction, successful appeal, retrial, reconviction, and finally his execution in 1922. Labeled the Midnight Marauder by the press, Mays invariably came to be associated with the serial rape and slaying of more than 15 working-class white women living near Knoxville's textile and manufacturing district. 5 years after Mays' state execution in 1922, Du Bois reported that 28-year-old Sadie Mendel walked into the Norton Police Department in Virginia and confessed to killing Birdie Lindsay, the very murder for which Mays had been condemned. Dressed in men's clothes and with her face blackened, she slipped into the Lindsay woman's home and killed her in bed. Mendel claimed the murder was in retaliation for an alleged affair the deceased had had with the confessor's husband. The police, however, remained unmoved by the young woman's belated testimony. Mendel's admission failed to instigate a formal police investigation, let alone incite possible prosecution, simply because she had a clean criminal record. Du Bois tersely records, Mrs. Mendel, despite her confession, was released because the record showed no charge against the woman. Mendel's guilt or innocence, however, is inconsequential relative to the more substantive problem signaled by the police's failed response to her confession. This procedural disruption indexes a larger cultural habit of racial privilege evinced throughout Mays' trial proceedings that bear sway even now. Whiteness tends to be associated with innocence, and it was to this resilient presumption that Mendel relied. Mendel's self-reported use of blackface and cross-dressing to execute Birdie Lindsay rehearsed the practiced use of blackface among white criminals to mask their identities and finger blacks in turn. Responding to the ubiquity of this criminal technique, R.B. Eliezer published the cautionary pamphlet Burnt Cork and Crime in 1931 for the Southern Commission on Interracial Cooperation, while Guy Johnson authored a similar report a decade later to the American Academy of Political and Social Science. I want to temporarily set aside Mendel's weaponization of blackface and the wide-ranging set of racial performances for which it stands not simply as an historical example, but as an ongoing response to Blackness. That an absent criminal record served as the linchpin settling Mendel's innocence for the police indexed a racial weighting of evidence that occurred in fields as seemingly diverse as life insurance and criminal jurisprudence. My focus this morning is on the most consequential vector that has determined the value of Black life since the end of Reconstruction, the racialization of crime realized through the disciplined production of a record, an information set, a body of putative evidence, an archive that cheapens Black life and ensures that neither guilty confessions nor preponderance of evidence can undo the socio-legal association of criminal liability with Blackness. Turn back with me to the 1890s, the moment when statistics joins with criminology, the moment when increasingly probative technologies proliferated the forms and kinds of evidence authorized to help determine the balance of human life in juridical settings, the moment that launched a national discourse on Negro crime, and the moment that installed a theory about American social and national progress measured through crime that more than a century later remains intact. This correlation of Blackness with criminality ensured the primacy of race, of Blackness, to borrow Ian Bachum's phrasing, the normative ground of civil society. In 1896, the year the Supreme Court rendered its landmark ruling in Plessy, prudential insurance actuary and statistician Frederick Hoffman published his landmark Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro. Hoffman's study furnished a record on Blackness, an archive for the early 20th century that shaped the discourse on Black crime from the turn of the century to the 1930s, provided a protocol for assembling and weighing what constitutes sufficient authoritative evidence, and prescribed how Black bodies should be read and discounted in the public commercial sphere. In 4 chapters and 330 pages, Hoffman reduced Blackness into a single quantifiable coordinate: liability, corporate, industrial, public health, social welfare, and criminal. It is not in the conditions of life, Hoffman insisted, but in the race traits and tendencies that we find the causes of excessive mortality. So long as immorality and vice are a habit of life of the vast majority of the colored population, the effect will be to increase the mortality by hereditary transmission of weak constitutions until gradual extinction results. Granting empirical weight to risk narratives, Hoffman reified popular theories of Black pathology, both in terms of Blacks as disease, pathogenic, and Blacks as criminally deviant, pathological, that had real consequences for the application of criminal jurisprudence. According to historian Khalil Muhammad, Hoffman's monograph was not only the first national study on Negro crime, but as a national crime expert, Hoffman, quote, continued to be the nation's premier source for the statistical reproduction of Black criminality figures outside of census reports until the creation of the FBI's Unified Crime Reports in the 1930s, end quote. If the 1890s launched what Muhammad describes as a racial data revolution, it necessarily ushered a crisis over evidence, its form, legitimacy, reliability, its material and epistemological use, particularly with respect to Black Americans. Reflecting on Hoffman's overworked data, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in his 1897 review of race traits, quote, "The conclusions drawn from these facts are, however, of doubtful value. On account of the character of the material, the extent of the field, and the unscientific use of statistical method. Simply, the book emphasizes the need of a Department of Negro Statistics in 1900 and of careful monographic study of the Negro in limited localities and from particular points of view," end quote. Both Du Bois and African-American political theorist Kelly Miller recognized Hoffman's work as symptomatic of a larger discursive mood towards science and the treatment of the so-called Negro question, and indicative of the kind of wrong-headed and dangerous conclusions arising from, quote, unscientific use of statistical method, end quote. Du Bois' foundational Atlanta Studies, a series of sociological studies covering a wide range of Black life, including family, health, education, and crime, marked the sociologist's own intervention into this expanding field of social scientific inquiry and race. Extending his path-breaking social scientific work in the Philadelphia Negro, the Atlanta Studies began the compilation of a minority report, a counter record. During his 5th month on death row, Mays wrote the first of at least 7 letters penned to Tennessee's Governor A.H. Roberts. Mays was neither a stranger to the law nor an unknown figure by the time he was arrested for allegedly murdering Byrd Lindsay in the early morning hours of August 30th, 1919, following what was already perceived as an attempted sexual assault and robbery gone awry by the unanticipated presence of the victim's cousin, or a parson, in Lindsay's home. The former proprietor of a juke joint in the center of Knoxville's red light district, the illicit mix of black and white clientele catered to in Mays Strollers Cafe matched Mays' own felicitous appreciation of white women. By 1919, Mays had not only gained the reputation of being a man who enjoyed the company of white women, he also bore a fierce enemy in local police officer Andy White. Whether arising from a rivalry over the affections of a particular white woman, as some insisted, or just plain spite, Officer White's enmity found measured expression in his almost weekly arrests of Mays and his oft-repeated desire to either see Mays in the penitentiary or on less forgiving days, seated on the executioner's electric chair. Unluckily for Mays, it was Officer White who responded to the police dispatch call that a white woman, Brady Lindsay, had been gunned down in her home. And it was Officer White who, according to Black Patrolman James Smith's trial testimony, pronounced Mays guilty even before they arrived on the scene. White told me he bet damned Maurice Mays killed that woman. Let's go and get him, Patrolman Smith stated. White's insistence on Mays' guilt, coupled with the eyewitness identification made by the victim's cousin and roommate, Ora Parsons, as Officer White's arms encircled her for support, closed the investigation. The complex racial ciphers that renders Mays' confessions of innocence unbelievable, that empowered a trial judge to forbid defense witnesses to recount the 15 assaults against white women during Mays' incarceration, and blatantly condemned their experiences, quote, incompetent evidence, that moved a jury to render a guilty verdict within 8 minutes in the absence of forensic evidence and in the face of questionable eyewitness testimony, found sanction in the racial data revolution for which Hoffman was both principal guide and resource. Mays' first death row epistle to Tennessee governor that January 1919 began the inmate's own minority report, his own record, replete with new evidence supporting his innocence and an insistent demand for clemency, if not full pardon. Please, entreated Mays, I beg that your honor permit me to submit to your kind consideration a letter just received today from a Knoxville minister pertaining to relate an attack on a white lady in her home, January 20th, 1920. The minister, you will note, says the newspaper failed to publish an account of the attack, which he says corresponds with the attack on Mrs. Lindsay, of which I am convicted for, and of which crime God knows I am innocent of. I will kindly request that you file this letter for future reference. Recasting himself as a cleric, simple courier, Mays offsets the biased signification of his standing as a convicted Black man. It is this Knoxville minister's concern over a recent spate of attacks against white women and their bearing on Mays' case that now demands the governor's immediate attention. 3 of these same kinds of attacks occurred in less than 3 weeks' time, pled Mays in July 1920, while I was in jail awaiting trial. But the police failed to charge those crimes to anyone. I am suffering from the testimony of manufactured evidence. Over the next year, Mays enclosed newspaper articles covering Knoxville's ongoing spree of sexual attacks. Letters from pastors and residents questioning Mays' conviction amidst a pattern of home invasions and assaults against low-income, working-class women. He ended each correspondence with the same solicitous request. I will kindly request that you file this letter for future reference. In 7 letters to a governor, Mays unwound the credibility and narrow assemblage of the records that condemned him to a death that only Tennessee's governor could refuse. What of this record that condemned Mays but permitted Sadie Mendel to confess murder with full impunity? Did Norton police officers fret over and make Sadie Mendel comfortable, perhaps offering a glass of cold water or sweet tea while she confessed to murder? Maybe she took her time describing the burnt cork she smeared on her skin and the men's clothes she borrowed to kill her husband's alleged paramour, Birdie Lindsay. Whether calm or hysterical, rational or mad, matters little against the cold calculation belied in her description of blackface. Such an intentioned deceit ably leveraged the racial calculus that transfigured Blackness into a synonym for criminality, a transfiguration Hoffman's race traits helped secure. This past Memorial Day, Amy Cooper demonstrated mastery of the same racial axiom Mendel's confession tacitly implied: Blackness equals criminal threat. Angered by Christian Cooper, an African-American bird watcher's request to abide by park rules and leash her dog, Amy Cooper threatened to call the police and accused Cooper of threatening her. Christian Cooper not only encouraged Amy to follow through with her threat, but filmed Amy's 9/11 call. Christian's video footage, his Minority Report, is telling. Amy's insistent repetition, African-American, 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 during her brief emergency call became a verbal shorthand for the threat, the imminent danger, for which her skillfully executed escalating scale of vocalized hysteria provided elaboration. Put simply, African-American in Amy Cooper's 9/11 call became an instantly discernible catchphrase for "My life is in danger at the hands of a Black man." With her 9/11 call, she sidled into a well-practiced, long-protected, and racially exclusive role of white damsel in distress. The audacity and latent potential, brutal material and legal consequences of Amy's lie for Christian Cooper, an innocent man enjoying birds in Central Park on Memorial Day, bore no consequence to her. That Amy was lying didn't matter, that she would be believed, and that her presumptive innocence would remain intact, even in spite of Christian Cooper's documented video footage, she felt certain. How might she have responded differently to Christian Cooper's innocuous request to leash her dog, had Amy known the lessons George Floyd's death provided? Had the bulging archive of evidence of anti-Black violence been treated as more than just our nation's Minority Report, our Black records, might we have surrendered less of our humanity, been less blind to racism's victims, and less willing to abide the lawless?
Thank you, Nicole. We have one question, and we're at the top of the hour. The question has to do with the fact that in the news, you hear a lot about the presence of police in our schools and about Black children, some as young as elementary, being arrested. Can you speak to what role that might play sort of in the future of these young children?
Well, that's a difficult question, right? One can imagine the presence of police in schools to be a traumatic experience. It's a sad state of affairs that we've arrived in a moment when we have a sign of a deepening and ever militarized presence of security within our public schools. How it will impact children? Undoubtedly adversely. Is it a necessary thing in our moment? Sadly, potentially is. Have we seen its damaging consequences to young African-American children in public schools? Yes, we have. When studies have shown the increased likelihood of them being treated differently and disciplined more aggressively in our primary and secondary schools.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And with that, we're going to end this session. I want to once again thank our three speakers for their outstanding presentations. I encourage you to join us again in an hour, which will be noon Central Time. We have a series of another outstanding series of talks that are shown here on the screen. I encourage you to come back for that, and that session will go from 12 to 1, and then we have one immediately after that from 1 to 2. So I look forward to seeing everybody again in about an hour. And again, thank you.